Be speaking to Sean O'Brien. He's founder of the Yale Privacy Lab and is an expert on artificial intelligence, cyber security, and blockchain. He's speaking to us from New Haven. Good afternoon.
How are you doing?
Right. So you'll be speaking in the New Haven Library on December 7th about artificial intelligence. The talk you have entitled AI, it's not funny. So that's this Saturday at 2 p.m. First off, could you explain what artificial intelligence is and how it's different from other kinds of computer programs?
Sure. So artificial intelligence is sort of a blanket term. It's used too widely, of course, and where we probably first have heard it is through the movies, right? We've heard it through things like Terminator and so on and so forth. So it really does cause a lot of confusion. Um, the important thing to know about artificial intelligence and what really distinguishes it from traditional computer programs is that it learns over time. Now, we use that word learns, right? That humanizes it. Um, but the way I sort of think about it is, a traditional software program is more like a recipe, right? So you have your instructions, you have your ingredients, and the machine, the computer, follows the instructions in the recipe and then outputs something, right? With artificial intelligence, the idea is that the computer program, the algorithm or set of algorithms in this case, right? It takes that recipe and then it takes a billion other examples of things that are like that recipe, right? And then it does some probabilistic matching, right? It does some pattern recognition. It basically has a huge amount of data, what they call a corpus, right? A set of training data. And then the algorithm gets better and better over time at producing some output that looks like what should result from that recipe, right? So I sort of think about it, to go back to the cooking analogy as like, imagine you went to a deli and you had a robot arm, right? And that robot arm was going to make you a sandwich, right? And maybe it was supposed to make a ham sandwich, but 10,000 times it has the ham on the outside and the bread in the middle, right? And it just over time gets better and better at making a ham sandwich. And it might use cheese whiz instead of provolone or whatever it does, but eventually it gets something that is pretty good, and can mimic humans or even surpass humans in some cases. And we now see programs that are really good at doing that.
Now, I don't want to go too deeply into matters you're going to talk about Saturday, but I wanted to talk about AI and the complaints of creators, from artists to actors. As I understand it, there's already been strikes by movie and TV performers over what AI can do with their images and video.
Yeah, so obviously, a technology like this is going to and has already, it's really going to create ripples in the economy and the wider society. And AI is a layer now in these computer networks that sort of envelop the globe and intermediate all of our interactions. Because these systems that are currently available primarily focus on generating output like text, writing, articles, etc., responses to questions, and so on. And also images, right? So artwork in many cases, or even now video. Because those systems do that, they're going to, of course, threaten labor in those areas and threaten artists and make it very difficult for creative folks not only to make a living, so to speak, although I'm not sure artists have ever made a living, really, or writers especially as well. But also, in those creative endeavors, it's going to be hard to avoid. And there's some real big ethical questions and also just creative questions about whether or not to incorporate AI, whether to use AI tools, and how much to do that, right? At all. Starting from sort of the framework, though, I think it's important, especially because you bring up the lawsuits, to kind of have some context about creative works and how it goes in the U.S. And I'll be brief, I swear. Um, but in the United States, right, when you create something, it's copyright to you by default, right? That is the all rights reserved message that you see all the time, right? But that has to be a human, right, that creates that work. And there's some famous examples. For example, there was a monkey selfie, right? Where an ape, actually, I think it was, took a camera from a photographer and took a selfie, right? And then that photo was sold by the photographer, and but then it was just copied everywhere as public domain. So there were a series of lawsuits and back and forth, but ultimately, the U.S. Copyright Office and the USPTO as well had guidance that said, hey, and there were a few rulings and appeals and everything else, but it said, hey, that photo was taken by an animal. So therefore, there's no copyright, it's public domain, right? Government documents, stuff that's produced with public funds is supposed to be public domain, meaning you can take public domain works and you can remix them and put them in a textbook or a phone book or whatever, and then you can sell that thing without having to worry about even acknowledging where the works came from.
Right.
Works in AI, especially what we're calling generative AI, things like ChatGPT, Mid-Journey, and these image generators, Dolly, and so on. Those works are public domain by default, or at least that's the current situation, right? So the guidance from the
Because they
Copyright
weren't
Office,
made by a human being.
that that's exactly right. And the onus for any copyright infringement or potential copyright infringement and any lawsuits around tort cases saying, "Hey, you've taken my work and you've injured my business by copying me," and so on. Um, that responsibility is in the hands of the operator, the person who asks the question of ChatGPT, right? So these court cases are kind of interesting. What's going on is, for example, the New York Times is basically saying, hey, you scraped massive amounts of data. You built this huge corpus, right? Remember that
Wait,
training set
wait,
I was.
one second. What's scrape mean?
Oh, so basically automating a computer program to go out and grab data that's out there on the internet and then
Okay.
put it into a training set or a database of some kind. So, I mean, a lot of the surveillance that goes on the internet, a lot of it is basically going around and grabbing public data. We've got millions of folks signing up for Blue Sky right now, right? And there are now dumps already in a couple of weeks of folks really getting into that network of public information. It's like millions and millions of profiles. So that's scraping. And from sort of an ethical and public goods situation, there's a real open question here. It's like we like to share things on the internet. The sharing economy is really important. This information system is really powerful, right? But these AI programs have gone and just built these huge databases, right? By grabbing all that data. And now they are sort of unleashing this technology on the world, and just creating all kinds of disruption. So there's some serious questions we have to address, right? Is this something we want, et cetera? Is this the death of the newspaper? I don't know if that's true. The Times wasn't doing so well over and over again for the last 20 years. It's basically been, their death being exaggerated, but they still sort of limp along. And traditional mainstream press, as I'm sure your listeners especially know, is not very good, is propagandized and so on. So, maybe it's okay for some of these industries to go away. But do we want AI answers, right? Do we want search engines that only give us AI output, right? That are making guesses and having so-called hallucinations, right? Trying to tell us what we want to hear, not necessarily what's accurate. It's a problem.
And I've
Um,
read that there's, because it looks at things that already exist, it sort of adopts the prejudices, particularly racial prejudices in its work.
And the biases there are really bad. So, and the first part, just more generally, if you've ever been in front of a class or you were on the other side of it as a student, of course, and you weren't paying attention to your teacher, right? And then they call on you, right? And then you sort of blurt out an answer that sounds like something that would be the correct answer. That's kind of like what these programs do, right? And when your training set is built on, these programs' training set is built on inequity, bias, and so on, racial profiling, then you're going to see that output in the programs. Facial recognition, right? Cameras that are, in traffic lights all over the place now, that people are using at obviously airports and so on, but also just even in their homes, and in their iPhones and so on. Those data sets were primarily programmed, at least in the early days, on inmates, for example. So they reflect the bias, that folks with dark faces are criminals, right? Because we have that bias in our incarceration programs, so if you're going to arrest more people who come from a specific background or look a certain way, then the software is going to reflect that because of the way that it matches, right? But to
So
to get back,
I'm sorry, finish.
yeah. I just because we got off, which is great. I like getting off topic, but I just want to make sure I finished on the creator thing because I think it's a really important point, and I'm sure you've got a lot of artists and musicians, et cetera, writers listening. Folks who are in creative industries have always had the issue of getting compensated fairly, right?
Hmm.
And every technology that comes out that sort of has published works widely, obviously all the stuff that was called piracy in the early 2000s and mid 2000s, BitTorrent and so on, and before that Napster, um, you know, that was publishing people's works widely, and a lot of artists sort of they get together and they say, hey, I have to strongly protect my copyright. um I think the answer is actually leaning into the sharing economy, and trying to instead fight for fair compensation and using the information system to get compensated. For example, we could have music players very easily that just send some small amount, let's say a few cents of some currency, right, directly to an artist every time you play their music. Right. You don't go through Spotify, which compensates artists terribly, right? You don't have to worry about folks grabbing your stuff. For most people, as we saw with some of the big releases like Radiohead's, release in Rainbows, when they said, "Hey, pay what you want," and they got lots and lots. Now that's a big band, of course, but small artists are still going to do better, sort of building those communities and leaning into it. Um, and then they're not going to have the same beats as everybody else or the same artwork as everybody else, the same backgrounds and styles as everybody else. Um, these systems, and this is where the overlap is with the bias, they are so-called garbage in, garbage out systems, right? Whatever's put into them affects the output. And if everybody starts using these, and it is now happening, there's like millions of Spotify examples out there now of just auto-generated beats and music. Um, Everything's going to sound the same, right? And if you want to differentiate yourself, and I think that's what you need to do. You need to actually differentiate yourself. You need to try to stay away from these tools where you, and when you can, and then you need to basically build a community around your music, which is not a great answer. It's hard work, but I think it's the only way we're going to get around this.
So you say stay away from these AI things when you can. Is it possible? I mean, I'm just a layman on this stuff, but you just see it everywhere. Copilot and all this stuff that comes conveniently.
Yeah, so I mean, this is something I struggle with myself, right? I build software. I've got folks, developers that I work with, and we've had a very strong policy of not incorporating AI into our work. But a lot of these questions are similar to questions we've had before. So, um, as I sort of like, I guess I'm beating around the bush a little bit, but these are centralized surveillance systems, right? This is really the continuation and sort of the amplification of what was being called cloud computing, although that word's not used as much as it used to be. In the teens, right? When 2010s, 2011s, when Facebook was sort of transforming itself, when all of our data was being shoved into iCloud, et cetera. This cloud computing centralization, and the surveillance being one really important aspect of that, but also some other environmental issues and so on. This is just sort of amplifying that, right? It's basically, a bunch of technology that is now sort of, I say unleashed on the world, but there really were some watershed moments in the past couple of years, especially in 2023 when ChatGPT was just like sort of given to everybody, quote unquote, to use. Of course, what you put into ChatGPT is being watched and training the training set, right? So certainly not a donation. But yeah, you have to think about it from that lens. Like, mm, should organizers use Facebook, right? Well, they have to meet people where they're at, right? Should organizers use Google Maps. Well, how are they going to find, et cetera, GPS and so on. All of those systems now have AI baked into them, right? Phones have it baked in. They're going to be more and more in the firmware, aka the hardware, the actual physical thing, in sort of that thin layer between software and hardware, which we could talk about maybe some other time. But an example would be, there are cell phones out there now where if you take a photo of the moon, it'll actually replace that moon with a high definition AI generated version of the moon, right? Would you even know that's in there? If you're using the Adobe suite and you're an artist, right? You're using all kinds of tools which are using technology which either is AI or sort of at the edges of what we would call AI and machine learning. And it's going to be very hard to stay away from this stuff, just like it was before and still is hard to stay away from proprietary software that has big tech stuff in it. So it's hard. What I try to do, and this is where the crossover, I think, between this issue and the climate issues, environmental issues generally, is I try not to judge individuals and sort of do virtue signaling or make it a pissing contest. Instead of talking about carbon credits, we could talk about, well, how much AI do you use and so on. So it's just not a great conversation to have. What I think we need to do is recognize that these are centralized systems that are wreaking a lot of havoc, that have had billions of dollars go into them, that are creating enormous amounts of inequity, and wealth in the 1% of the 1% of the 1%. I mean, NVIDIA is just one example, but we're talking about multi-trillion dollar wealth transfers happening with this technology. It needs to be talked about in those contexts as sort of a systems issue first, and then we can talk about strategies about what we're going to do. Now, you can,
Now,
on a personal level, keep yourself away from it as much as possible, but you're going to fall into traps just like you fall into traps in the environmental issue, just like I am certain I use more energy than I should, right?
well, speaking of that, you'll be talking for Promoting Enduring Peace this Saturday, and their big interests are environment and war. So, if we could just touch on a couple of things. One is the amazing amount of energy that AI uses. Why is that?
Sure. So, and this goes back to sort of the differences between it and traditional software. But also I think it points to the wastefulness of the designs of these systems and our networking infrastructure in general. Any good technology, as good as it possibly can be, once it goes through sort of the meat grinder of Silicon Valley and these venture firms and ends up being at the center of our, banking systems and so on and so forth. Anytime that kind of happens, the technology can be designed in an awesome, cool way in the beginning, and at the end of the process, it's wasteful. It generates an enormous amount of waste, not just that is quantifiable like energy, but all kinds of issues, around manufacturing of machines and so on that are harder to quantify, and dumping of materials and so on, and mining of materials, which is harder to quantify, et cetera. And of course, there's labor issues, which we can get into as well. But a lot of these chipsets that I'm talking about, that are AI powered already or will be AI powered, the folks who are putting those together, who are assembling those and getting the raw materials, obviously, it's the equivalent of slave labor if it isn't just slave labor, right? So all kinds of waste issues there, just generally with technology. The phone in your pocket is a problem from that standpoint. And it's probably only possible because of the exploitation of not just labor, but the earth, obviously, the environment. Okay. Putting that out of the way,
Could we have lived without this? I mean, the environmental problems are huge, and by 2030 we go off edges. And did we have to take this AI road?
well, the AI stuff, the reason it amplifies, and I guess I got on a tangent there, but the reason it amplifies those issues that I brought up just generally with 2024 computers, right? Um, is because of this messy way, this probabilistic way of learning that it has, of pattern matching, right? Because it's so inefficient, especially in the learning phase, right? It requires an enormous amount of energy. And it's getting really, really good at replying to you. For example, if you use ChatGPT and you ask it a question, and replying with information that seems correct, but is also really detailed, right? So it'll produce basically a whole, article that looks like a journal article from an academic with maybe fake citations, maybe some real, et cetera, but it's really well structured and good at now producing that. And that sort of activity takes an enormous amount of computing power. Stitching together these images, through pattern matching, recognizing faces, these things. It's doing it not the way a human would, right? A human recognizes faces because we're really good at it from a cognitive structure we're born with in our brain. We can tell the difference between faces. These programs have to match, between an enormous amount of images to kind of learn what a face looks like in the first place, let alone come up with its version of what your face or what it thinks your face looks like, right? And there's a ton of energy problems there. Now, this is starting to revive a lot of interest in nuclear, which, of course, a lot of environmentalists, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of environmentalists are concerned about. I'm certainly concerned about it. Talking about Microsoft, firing up 3 Mile Island again, is should be pretty concerning, I think, to anyone in the U.S., but not just in the U.S. I mean, elsewhere. We could create some real instability here, even if, for example, nuclear reduced the carbon footprint of this tech. Do we need it? I don't think so. I think the important thing as you go through your life as an individual is to look at the processes you have and not make yourself AI dependent. So even if you can't avoid the stuff that's out there, you don't want to end up in a situation where the only way you know how to do something requires this AI intermediary. That's partially because, this is sort of a boom at the moment, but we don't know when we have instability, what's going to happen. If shit hits the fan again with a pandemic, are these giant farms, server farms with massive amounts of energy that this AI technology requires, are they going to be feasible? Is big tech just going to fall apart the same way the banks fell apart, during the recession, and need to be quote unquote bailed out because they're too big to fail? Are you going to have AI basically intermediating a part of your work, a part of your lifestyle, part of your activism that you can't replace if it goes away or you get cut off?
Well,
I remind
speaking
people, yep.
of, I'm sorry, you want to
I
finish that?
remind, sorry, I'm cutting you off. I'm talking way too much, but I just want to make sure I remind people, the bill is going to come due, right? ChatGPT is free for now. There's already some signs that they're moving a lot of people into subscriptions, and a lot of people do pay for OpenAI subscriptions and other products. You know, there wasn't billions of dollars shoved into these things for them to never be paid for by the public, both literally and figuratively. So that's the other piece of it. If you think you have a problem now with having too many subscriptions and paying too much for your internet bill, don't think there won't be a squeeze around AI with that stuff as well.
Well, the last thing I want to get into again briefly is this business when you mentioned faces, the military aspect. An Israeli leftist site, 972 Mag, about 6 months ago had a piece that an AI program called Lavender is used by the Israeli Air Force, and it was designed to mark all suspected operatives in the so-called military wings of Hamas and Islamic Jihad as potential bombing targets. And it came up with 37,000 people to kill. And the article says the Army gave sweeping approval for officers to target all these people on these kill lists. Pretty staggering.
Yeah, yeah. So a few things to emphasize there. The first thing is that this technology has always been military technology, pioneered in the United States, right? Artificial intelligence, but computing in general, of course, coming out of the Defense Department, the internet, and so on, GPS, all these technologies that drones rely upon to target folks. That is military technology. Um, AI has gone through a series of funding, booms and then chills. Literally since the late 70s, folks have been calling these AI winters in the industry, where there's like not an interest because AI didn't quite turn out to do what folks thought it would do. But the military has always been there backing that budget, right? The Defense Department, specifically in the United States, but also other countries as well. We're going to talk about it a little bit on Saturday, but basically, there's always been serious investment in research and hope by the Pentagon that they're going to be able to automate warfare and that they're going to be able to do good targeting, accurate targeting, let's say, or at least just targeting in general that fulfills their goals. Let's say maybe it's inaccurate, but it fulfills some goal of the Pentagon's. That they're going to do this with these automated systems. And we're going to look at least one of the papers on this from a think tank that's heavily military funded. But the facial recognition piece is really problematic. That, of course, is being sort of married with the surveillance apparatus generally, which AI is learning on. So, for example, there are versions of both me and you, Stan, that are inside the NSA's data center somewhere that are basically doppelgangers of us, right? There's like shadow profiles, whatever you want to call them. Um, Whatever the government thinks we are, whatever the government thinks our face looks like, whatever the government thinks we're involved in. And those kinds of things and the selectors, as they were called from the Snowden files and the systems that Snowden, disclosed. Um, those selectors are being used now by these kill machines. As we saw from Predator drones, this stuff has been around, but now it's being automated at a scale that's really problematic. And we should be worried, when you have police dogs that are robots going around and they're talking about, oh, well, we're trying to figure out how to put a flamethrower on it. That's literally something that's going on. And now
Elon Musk sells flamethrowers.
that's
He
right.
has a whole division with that.
Of course, it's not a coincidence there so much, but these projects they always start in this private sector. I mean, there literally is, there's many examples of those machine dogs by Boston Dynamics originally, having weapons attached to them. And the story is sort of like, oh, well, this is just sort of, research that we're doing. We're trying to figure out if this is even possible, and then eventually gets implemented, right? So when I see these things, it's sort of like I don't freak out right away. It's not necessarily going to be everywhere right away. It might fail and be really bad at what it does, but lives get lost, right? And we should have a serious conversation about it. Um, and then eventually, unfortunately, on the trajectory of where we've been headed, like the stuff that we're now living with, people were talking about 20, 30 years ago, even, and it's becoming ubiquitous. Are we going to have drones flying around recognizing our faces? And is that going to be ubiquitous in the civil society as well as in warfare? And then in warfare and maybe the civil society, is it going to be killing people? It's a problem. And I don't want everything to be nightmarish Terminator fantasies. I think we need to have first honest discussions about our own role with these technologies and, whether we're using them, how we're using them, should we be using them, the kinds of questions we've just been batting back and forth. But we have to keep the military piece, in view, because that is and could be the kind of thing that triggers, major wars, maybe, nuclear war. So
Well, on this happy note, I want to thank you for the interview. Um, Before I forget, what is your website? We can put it up on the screen.
sure. So ivycyber.com, IVY cyber, cyber.com. That's got sort of a profile of me, but we're going to be doing workshops on digital self-defense, talking about strong passwords and how to use encryption and so on, the kind of stuff I've been teaching for a long time. I'm going to be moving those workshops to that site, so that's definitely a space to watch. And then if you want to check out privacylab.yale.edu, yale.edu, that's going to have basically our upcoming workshops for the spring. We're putting together that schedule sort of now, trying to get it in before the end of the school year or the semester here, the winter semester. Um, and in the spring, we're going to have some workshops that are available to not just Yaleys, but the public as well. And I want to make sure I always emphasize that, it's really important to me to make sure that the work that we're doing as sort of academics, we're also making sure that folks who are, just living and working in any profession are exposed to. Breaking down that barrier is something that I've really been working on for a long time. So.
Great. Well, looking forward to seeing you on Saturday. And to repeat, Sean O'Brien will be speaking in the New Haven Library. That's 133 Elm Street, opposite the New Haven Green, this Saturday, December 7th at 2 p.m. It'll be in the community room, which is downstairs, and you can reach it most quickly via the Temple Street entrance. More about this at pepeace.org. Thank you all for watching, and thank you again, Sean.
Thank you so much.